Climate Change 2, Part 2, Kyoto to Paris. The last part we looked at the theory of climate agreements within the context of the prisoner's dilemma game. And we looked at Scott Barrett's model could introduce a treaty signing stage that meant that you converted the prisoner's dilemma game into a game where signing up to the climate treaty is a weakly dominant strategy, and so you could actually get countries signing up to a treaty and abating as an equilibrium strategy for the game. We're now going to turn to look at some of the climate agreements that have been signed and the somewhat tortuous process that the global political system has gone through in terms of trying to get agreements about abating greenhouse gases. We'll also look at the role of the IPCC, which you can think about as being a collection of scientific experts that advise the process and try to predict what the effects of climate change are going to be on things like sea level. So we go back to 1990. So the IPCC produced its first assessment report, and it concluded that temperatures have already risen by 0.3 to 0.6 degrees Celsius over the last century, and that all the likelihood is that human emissions of greenhouse gases were causing global warming. In 1992, this led to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change being agreed at the Earth Summit in Rio, and its key objective was the stabilisation of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system, and developed countries agreed to return their emissions to 1990 levels, and this was a very important agreement. 1995 we have the second assessment report. This is now getting a bit more confident that it's saying there's a discernible human influence on the Earth's climate, and this has been called the first definitive statement that humans are responsible for climate change. So as time is passing, then the IPCC is bringing together stronger and stronger evidence of this human effect on climate change. 1997, the Kyoto Protocol is agreed. Developed nations pledged to reduce emissions by an average of 5% by the period 2008 to 12, with wide variations on targets for individual countries. And Kyoto is running into problems as a treaty because the US Senate immediately declares that it will not ratify the treaty. So one of the biggest polluter at that time was not going to be part of the process. 2001, George Bush removes the US from the Kyoto process. Also in 2001, the IPCC finds new and stronger evidence that humanity's emissions of greenhouse gases are the main cause of the warming seen in the second half of the 20th century. So again, the evidence is stacking up. 2005, some 8 years after Kyoto was negotiated, then there have been sufficient signatories for Kyoto to become international law for those countries who have actually signed up. 2006 is probably the first time that economists make a substantial contribution to the debate. I mean, there have been previous economic analyses, and this comes with the Stern Review, which concludes that climate change could damage global GDP by up to 20% if left unchecked, but curbing it at that time would cost about 1% of global GDP. So Stern was quite a strong advocate of there being significant action now to prevent catastrophic outcomes of climate change for future generations. 2007, the IPCC's fourth assessment report concludes it is more than 90% likely that humanity's emissions of greenhouse gases are responsible for modern day climate change. So again, another step up in the certainty that the IPCC has that human greenhouse gas emissions are causing climate change. 2007, IPCC and former US Vice President Al Gore received the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts to build up and disseminate greater knowledge about man-made climate change and to lay the foundations for measures that are needed to counteract such change. 2007, at UN negotiations in Bali, governments agree the 2-year Bali roadmap aimed at hammering out a new global treaty by the end of 2009. 2 months before taking office, incoming US President Barack Obama pledges to engage vigorously with the rest of the world on climate change, and this was a departure from the approach taken by George Bush. 2009, China overtakes the US as the world's biggest greenhouse gas emitter, although the US remains well ahead on a per capita basis. 2009 as well, 192 governments convene the UN Climate Summit in Copenhagen with expectations of a new global agreement high, but they leave only with a controversial political declaration, the Copenhagen Accord. So Copenhagen, there were big expectations for Copenhagen, but it ended up being a flop, basically. Developed countries begin to contribute to a $30 billion 3-year deal on Fast Start finance to help developing countries green their economies and adapt to climate impacts. The UN summit in Mexico does not collapse as had been feared, but ends with agreements on a number of issues. And the first part of the IPCC's fifth assessment report says scientists are 95% certain that humans are the dominant cause of global warming since the 1950s. All right, so in this account we see that the IPCC's confidence is growing by about 5% with each report. Finally, in 2015, COP21, also known as the 2015 Paris Climate Conference, for the first time in over 20 years of UN negotiations, aims to achieve a legally binding and universal agreement on climate with the aim of keeping global warming below 2%. So this is the most significant step since Kyoto, in that countries are now saying we're agreeing to keeping global warming below 2%. Why 2%? Well, this is a difficult issue because there's no guarantee that keeping global warming below 2% won't have catastrophic environmental consequences. No one really knows, and I suppose if I'm being cynical, it's a nice round number that politicians think they understand and could agree to. How are they going to actually achieve that? Well, the devil, as always, is in the detail. But what COP21 provides is a set of country plans, and we're going to look at some of these country plans with a view to seeing to what extent countries are leaders in terms of addressing climate change, to what extent they're free riders, and the actions that they're going to take to address their commitments to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Just before I do that, this set of graphs here, so they show the sources of greenhouse gases. So the big polluters from diagram A are China, United States, European Union, India, Russian Federation. When we look for Australia, then Australia appears around about in the middle of the table. So those first 4 or 5 countries are the big polluters. What's been happening over time? Well, if you compare China's pollution of in terms of carbon dioxide, then China has been increasing its emissions of carbon dioxide, and that reflects China's massive economic growth from 1990 up to 2015. The United States is stable or declining slightly in terms of its greenhouse gas emissions. So between 2000 and 2015, then the US had a decline in carbon dioxide emissions. The European Union, in contrast, has a declining emissions of carbon dioxide. They've declined quite sharply from 1990 through to 2015. India's going the other way. So India is growing, becoming more industrialized, and has an increase in carbon dioxide emissions from 1990 through to 2015. If we switch now to diagram B, then this shows a different perspective on it, in that diagram B gives us the carbon dioxide emissions per capita. So it's now Canada, Australia, the United States, Saudi Arabia, Kazakhstan, Russian Federation. It's these countries that are the big polluters per capita. And Australia, on this basis, is viewed as having a fairly poor record in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, because it's at this time it was second in the world in terms of carbon dioxide emissions, and there's some indication that those carbon dioxide emissions are actually increasing a bit between 1990 and 2015. So Australia is viewed in terms of carbon dioxide emissions as a relatively dirty country, and I suppose this reflects the Australian lifestyle, dependence on coal for a large part of electricity generation, tendency to have weak public transport systems in cities that means that people are dependent on cars. The cars that people drive in Australia are also on relatively high capacity engines compared to say people in Europe. So perhaps to put Australia's situation in perspective, if you look at the UK, then the UK has a per capita emission of around about 6 tonnes of CO2 per head per year, and that quantity is declining, whereas Australia has got approximately 18 tonnes of CO2 emitted per capita per year. So that's almost that's 3 times as much. So I'm now just going to have a quick look at the country plans. So the USA, what do they say they're going to do as in response to the Paris conference? So the United States intends to achieve an economy-wide target of reducing its greenhouse gas emissions by 26 to 28% below its 2005 level in 2025, and to make best efforts to reduce its emissions by 28%. So the US is using a 2005 baseline, and this graph here indicates what it plans to do. So it's going to end up being somewhere between 26% and 28% below its 2005 emissions by 2025, with an intermediate target of being 17% below 2005 levels in 2020. You might notice from this solid line here, which is the historical emissions, that actually the US economy seems to be becoming less carbon intensive through time. So it's of their own accord, as part of the move towards renewable energies, more efficient production processes, then you see that the US has had a declining greenhouse gas emissions. I'm not sure what these projected emissions are about, really. They seem to me to be very high, and would seem to be unlikely that the US would actually start to increase its greenhouse gas emissions significantly over the next 15 to 20 years. The other comment to make about the US is that the election of Donald Trump means that there's some uncertainty about what the future commitment of the US is going to be. Trump took the US out of the Paris climate agreement in June 2017. The EU is perhaps a bit different from the US in that it has had a long-term commitment to the UN framework on climate change, has already introduced an emission trading scheme, and there's actually substantial evidence that the EU has actually reduced its emissions of greenhouse gases over the last 25 years. And so the EU comes up with this much stronger statement. The EU and its member states are committed to a binding target of at least 40% domestic reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 compared to 1990, to be fulfilled jointly as set out in the conclusions by the European Council of October 2014. I find Australia's position is a bit strange. So Australia has this position of being per capita one of the world's highest emitters of greenhouse gases. And I've given you this statement in full because it's got some interesting points in it. So first of all, Australia states that it's pretty good at complying with international treaties. Yeah, that's accepted. Australia is going to adopt a direct action policy, which we'll see, as we'll see later, is quite an expensive way of reducing greenhouse gases. And Australia has actually repealed the much much stronger policy that they had in place, which was a carbon tax. And it seems to be saying that Australia will comply with the Paris Agreement conditional on other countries complying with the agreement. And Australia will implement an economy-wide target to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2030, taking on a stronger target. So we will implement the 28% target should circumstances allow, taking into account opportunities to reduce emissions and factors such as the costs of technology. Australia reserves the right to adjust our target and its parameters before it is finalised under a new global agreement, should the rules and other underpinning arrangements of the agreement differ in a way that materially impacts the definition of our target. So this seems to me to be quite a weak statement by Australia. They're not really committing to leadership, but I suppose that's understandable because Australia in total doesn't account for a large proportion of the globe's greenhouse gas emissions. So just to recap, so you have to say there's been a slow response by countries. Some have shown leadership, such as the EU. Others, like Australia and the US, have lagged behind and appear to be free riding at times. And in Australia, as we'll see, there's been no cross-party agreement about how to address climate change, and it's basically become a political football. So Paris COP21 is the first international climate agreement with strong commitments from the main polluters, that is the US and China. And just one review question: what is the role of the IPCC in climate change policy?